is a Hasselblad 500C. It is a medium format film camera, which means it's going to produce a negative that is larger than your 35mm negatives are. In the long run, that means we can print them much larger and with much more detail. This is the type of film that it takes. This is actually the same type of film that we usually shoot 35mm, as you can see, Kodak T-Max 400. But this is 120 film, as opposed to 35mm film, which is usually marked as being 135. The box has 5 rolls in it, and they look like this. So this, like your 35mm cameras, can be loaded in regular light. I think in the instructions it says to load it in subdued light, but generally speaking, your film will be fine if you load it in the classroom when all the lights are on. Okay. Now, this camera does kind of have several different parts to it. There's the camera body here, which has the viewfinder on it, and then it's got what we call the camera back. The camera back is what holds the film, and we're going to have to remove it in order to actually load the camera. So as you can see on the top of the Hasselblad, there's a little kind of circular latch, which if we push, we can then take the back off of the camera. Okay. As you can see, here's your shutter. This camera has a dark slide in it, which needs to be removed in order for a photograph to be taken, which keeps your film from being exposed when the back is off of the camera. Okay? The back has a few other things on it. This is your winding lever. This is your exposure meter that'll tell you how many pictures you've taken. And this is how we open it. When you open the camera, there will already be a reel on the left-hand side of it, and there will be nothing on the right-hand side of it. That is by design, so you don't have to go in and moving these reels around. Okay? So, without further ado, okay, you're going to have to remove this band in the middle in order to load it. So you can go ahead and kind of carefully take that off. Now, I said that you could load this kind of in the classroom, but that certainly doesn't mean that you should be running around and letting it unspool, okay? Keep it as tightly spooled as you can throughout this entire process, just to keep your film from getting exposed, okay? So, this film goes in this side of the back, okay? It's got notches in the top and bottom, so it can kind of fit in there. Now, before I put it in, I just kind of want you to understand how this film is going to be reeled, okay? So ultimately, your film is going to want to come and bend around this side, be flat over here, and then bend around this one. So as you can see, I'm going to take the open part of the film where the tongue is, and I'm going to put it next to that reel column. That way I can kind of bend it around and pull it flat along that back. Okay? Now make sure, I don't know if you can see this or not, make sure that the film is going underneath this little metal piece. Okay, that is absolutely essential. Okay, so I'm continuing to pull around this reel column, and then here is kind of the other reel column that will be left in there from the previous roll of film. You can just kind of move it over. Okay, it's got a slat in it that kind of goes all the way through. So you're gonna fit it in there until you can. It's a little hard to see, but if you look down here, you might be able to see the film start to poke through. There is a pretty considerable amount of extra space built into these rolls of film, so don't worry about pulling too much. Yeah, there you can see it. That being said, you certainly don't want to pull the whole roll of film out. Now, before I reel this very much, First of all, I'm just gonna make sure that it's caught and that it's reeling properly. But then I'm gonna look back over here. Because on the right-hand side of this back, this little red arrow will ultimately line up with an arrow that is on the kind of paper backing on this film. And that's how I will know that I'm ready to go. See how those two arrows line up? Okay, so now I want to make sure that my back is ready to, well, that this cartridge is ready to go into the back. So I'm gonna go ahead and lock it again. And then it can be inserted the same way it came out into the back of the camera. Oh, you know what? I actually have to do this out of order. And then I lock it. Okay? Now the back goes on the body of the camera. You can see there's like these little notches down here that this fits into. It folds up, and then this button again kind of gets slid to the right, and then it gets connected again. Now I've got a camera that's almost ready to shoot. If I come over to this side of the camera where I'm looking at the film advancing lever, I've got to advance the film until I can see the number 1 here in the exposure counter. Okay, so that's pretty easy. Just gonna go ahead and advance it until that little 1 pops up. And I'm ready to go. Okay, we loaded our camera, we're ready to go. One thing to keep in mind is that these rolls of film, they only have 12 exposures on them. So considering that it doesn't have a light meter on it, yes, you could use an external light meter or a light meter on your phone if you're not in school. But other than that, it would be a very good idea for you to bracket your exposures. So again, that just means every picture you want to take, you should maybe take 2 or 3 times with slightly different exposure settings just to make sure that the image is going to come out. So I'm here, I'm still in the dark room. I'm going to take this incredibly, amazingly creative photograph of the enlarging station. This is just for demonstration's sake, folks. And I'm ready to go. We loaded it, we advanced the film, and we're ready to go. So this camera has a top-down viewfinder. As you can see, it's open right now, but it's going to be closed when you get it, which means you're going to kind of be standing above, looking down into the viewfinder. Just let me bring this over here for a second. If you take a look at the top of this camera, kind of like the camera back, the viewfinder has a little kind of lever on it also, which gets pushed to the side, and then the viewfinder will flip up. Let's see if we can see what's going on in there. This is a horrible camera angle. Well, you get the idea. It is actually kind of hard to see what's in there right now because of the lighting in here. I've got lights that are like coming right into the viewfinder, which makes it very hard to see. And you might find yourself in a similar situation. So when that's the case, when you're trying to look through the viewfinder and you can't see through the lens, could be one of 2 things. It could be you've taken a photo and you didn't advance yet, or it just could be that you might have to just kind of provide yourself a little bit of shade in order to see what you're doing, which is why with a lot of, you see a lot of people using mostly large format cameras, and they kind of have a blanket that they pull over their head. It's so that they can kind of see everything through the viewfinder properly. I want to take a look at the lens for a second, because this is kind of how you're going to set your exposure settings. Everything is right here on the lens. Your apertures are listed down here, 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, blah, 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 and your shutter speeds are above it. Okay? 1, 2, 4, 8, so on and so forth. So the way that you set your exposure settings on this camera is you actually need to get the 2.8 matched up with the 500 first. And the way to do that is there's a little kind of latch on the aperture ring here that can be pushed down, and then the aperture ring can be slid over. So I'm going to slide the 2.8 over to near the 500. so that the 2.8 matches up with 500. And then I need to move the whole ring until the 500 and the 2.8 match up with that black line. Now that is likely not going to be a good exposure for me right now because I'm here in the darkroom. I'm going to go back to 2.8 and 1/60th of a second to take my photo. If we come over the front of the camera, a couple of important things. Here's your shutter release button. You can just push it in order to take a picture. This shutter release button will not work if the dark slide is still in the camera, and I'll go over that in a second. And this is your film advancing lever. Okay, so let's bring the whole thing together and just kind of take a picture and see how it works. Okay, so as previously mentioned, there is a dark slide in between the camera body and the back of the camera. Okay, it keeps the film safe. It also will prevent your shutter release from working if it's in. So you're walking around the camera, that dark slide should be in. But if you're ready to take a picture, you've got the image composed in the viewfinder, you've got your exposure settings set. The last thing you need to do is pull out that dark slide. Keep it safe. Because you're gonna have to put it right back in a second anyway. Now that the dark slide is out, I can take a picture. I've got my exposure settings already. I'm gonna reach around to the exposure button on the front of the camera and I'm gonna push it. That is a great sound. And a few things are gonna happen, right? The exposure's been made, so I can put my dark slide back in. If I looked in the viewfinder right now, I would see nothing. I would just see gray. And my viewfinder is not gonna come back in. I'm not gonna be able to start seeing through it again until I advance the film. Film advancing lever has got these two circles on it. Okay, there's a solid one and then there's an outlined one. As you can see, since I just took a picture, there's nothing in the viewfinder right now. So in order to advance, I'm gonna turn this knob all the way until I'm back. And as I do that, I should see an image start to come back in my viewfinder. The other thing you'll see is that your exposure meter now says 2 because you've taken your first picture and you're on to your second. And that's basically it. You're gonna do that 12 times, take the dark slide out, make the exposure, advance all the way, put the dark slide back in. Well, actually, put the dark slide back in right after you take the exposure. And then, once your exposure meter says 12, it's time to unload the camera. So, we're pretending that we're on exposure 12. We've already taken exposure 12. We're ready to take our film out and get ready to process it. The first thing to do, of course, is come over to your film advancing lever and advance the film all the way. There's no film lock or anything like that. With a 35mm camera, you're just gonna advance and advance and advance. Much is the same as the 35mm camera. Eventually you're gonna hear and feel a little something, which kind of makes you feel like the film has been advanced all the way. Okay, so let's go ahead and do that. Okay, yep, it's got a little slack, which means our film is advanced all the way. Okay, so come over here. We can take the cartridge out of the back of the camera. And this is, or something like this, is what your film is gonna look like, right? Here's where our film was. It's now transferred entirely over to the other reel. And it's rewound all the way, which means it's pretty safe. Again, this is in the directions. It tells you to do this in subdued light, but that wouldn't do my video any good. And what's pretty cool about it, if you are not gonna process this right away, is that it has this little kind of seal built into the film. Okay, it works the same way an envelope does, so if you lick it, then you can keep your film safe, and it kind of says exposed on it, so you know that it's already been, it's a finished roll of film. Okay? The last thing you need to do in order to prepare the camera for the next person is just in the same way that when we opened our back of our camera, there was a reel on this side. You need to transfer that empty reel over. Get it fit in there. Because it will not let us put the cartridge back into the film backing without that reel being in the right place. Okay? Okay, processing time. In order to do this, you'll need a double tank, even though you're only processing one roll of film. You will need one of our normal 35mm reels extended to fit 120 film. Again, you're gonna look for one of these first before you do it yourself so that we don't end up having too many of them. And you will need a double reel column, which when inserted will come out the top a little bit, but that's fine. I'm gonna go ahead and do this for you now, even though it's gonna mean that I'm ruining this roll of film, in hopes that it prevents you from ruining your roll of film. There's only one picture on this roll anyway, so. But you're imagining now, of course, that you're in the loading room, right? First thing you need to do, of course, is get this thing that you just used to seal your film apart so that you can pull the film out. Now, again, you're doing this in pitch darkness. What you will find when you start to unravel it is that you have kind of two different spools moving together. You've got a paper spool, which is supposed to keep your film safe, and then you have a much heavier, much thicker spool of film, okay? I know you can't get this from watching the video, but this is much thicker, it's much heavier weight than the paper is. This is just paper, okay? So you're gonna kind of pull that all the way out. And then you're gonna cut where it meets up with that paper so that you have your film on its own, okay? Now, from here on out, everything is the same as it's always been, however, slightly more difficult. You've got much thicker film to deal with. It's kind of gonna wanna curl around itself a bit in the same way 35mm film does. So one of the hardest parts about shooting medium format for us, I imagine, is going to be getting it onto the reel. Because part of it is like muscle memory, because you've done this so many times before, but orders of magnitude more difficult because of how larger the film is and how much it kind of curls in on itself and how heavy it is. Now I know I just made that look easy, but believe me, it's just because I have lots of practice. I have spent just as much time in the loading room as you will likely trying to get medium format film loaded onto the reel, okay? Everything else is exactly the same, except you'd follow the instructions, of course, for processing 2 rolls of film at the same time, which just means you need to mix a different amount of film developer for yourself. Have fun.